Chapter 8. It was slow to arrive. October 23rd dragged by uneventfully, except that the pack was working somewhat under the influence of the northeast wind. When, at 6:45 p.m. on October 24th, the pressure did arrive, it wasted no time. There had been pressure in the past, but nothing like this. It moved through the pack like a sluggish shockwave, making the entire surface of the ice into a chaos of churning, tumbling destruction. Macklin watched it briefly, then turned away in disbelief. The whole sensation, he recorded, was of something colossal, of something in nature too big to grasp. Effortlessly, the ice jostled and badgered the ship until she was pinned up against two floes, fore and aft on the starboard side, and kneed in the center on the other. A heavy mass of ice ground across her stern, tearing the stern post partly away from the starboard planking. Water poured in. McNeish was sent to check and reported back that it was rising rapidly in the forward hold. Rickenson said the same of the engine room. The small portable Downton pump was rigged and stern was raised to operate the engine room bilge pumps. They were going by 8 p.m., but they failed to hold the water in check. All hands that could be spared were put on the primary hand pumps alongside the main mast. But after several minutes of pumping, no water had come up. The intakes were obviously frozen. Worsley took Hudson and Greenstreet with him down into the bunkers. Working in almost total darkness and icy cold, they dug and squirmed their way down to the keel through the wet, slimy coal into which the blubber from 80 seals had been dumped. The sounds of the tormented ship were deafeningly close. They poured bucket after bucket of boiling water into the frozen pipe. One of the men played the flame of a blowtorch on the stubborn fittings while the other two pounded to loosen the clogged intakes. Finally, after an hour's work, the pumps broke loose. McNeish commenced to build a cofferdam 10 feet forward of the sternpost to seal off the after section of the ship and hold back the water. Between 15-minute spells at the pumps, some of the crew helped him caulk the cofferdam with strips of torn blankets. Others went over the side with picks and ice saws to cut lines of weakness in the attacking floes. But as soon as each trench was dug, the ice crumpled along it, then bore in again. All night long they kept at it, 15 minutes on the pumps, 15 minutes off, then over the side or back to the engine room. Though they were lean and hard after a year's tough work on the ship and on the sledges, 10 hours at the pumps and saws left even the strongest so exhausted they stumbled as they walked. At dawn, Shackleton ordered an hour's rest, and Green ladled out a bowl of porridge for each man. Then it was time to begin again. Toward mid-morning, Shackleton sent the dog drivers over the side to ready their teams and sledges in case of an immediate abandonment. Worsley took a party of seamen and cleared the boats for lowering. Most of them had stopped and watched the pack in their struggle to save the ship. It had settled down some, but it was behaving strangely. Pressure ridges of a height never before seen rose between the floes, and the compression was fantastic, as if the pack had been shoved up against some solid barrier over the horizon. The men worked at the pumps and at building the cofferdam through the day and evening. About midnight, after 28 hours of ceaseless work, McNeish finished his job, at least as well as it could be finished. But it only slowed the flow of water, and the pumps had to be kept going. Each spell was an agony of effort, and when it was finished, the men staggered to their bunks or slumped into a corner. It took perhaps 10 minutes for their exhausted muscles to loosen enough to let them sleep. Then, just as they dozed off, they were prodded up for their next turn. Toward evening, the pressure increased again. The flow along the port side ground against the ship, warping her along her entire length, and wringing animal-like screams from her as the ice sought to break her back. At 9 p.m., Shackleton instructed Worsley to lower the boats and to get all essential gear and provisions onto the floe to starboard, which seemed the least likely to break up. Late in the evening, the men on deck saw a band of about 10 emperor penguins. They waddled slowly up toward the ship, then stopped a short distance away. Emperors, singly or in pairs, were a common sight, but nobody had ever seen so large a group before. The penguins stood for a moment watching the tortured ship, then raised their heads and uttered a series of weird, mournful, dirge-like cries. It was all the more eerie because none of the men, not even the Antarctic veterans among them, had ever before heard penguins voice anything except the most elemental, croaking sorts of noises. The sailors stopped what they were doing, and old Tom McLeod turned to Macklin. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Will none of us get back to our homes again?" Macklin noticed Shackleton bite his lip. About midnight, the movement of the ice partly closed the wound in the stern, and the flow of water decreased, but still the hand pumps had to be manned to keep the water from gaining. They stayed at it all night, working with closed eyes, like dead men attached to some evil contrivance which would not let them rest. It was no better at dawn or at noon. About 4 o'clock, the pressure reached new heights. The decks buckled and the beams broke. The stern was thrown upward 20 feet, and the rudder and stern post were torn out of her. The water ran forward and froze, weighing her down in the bow so that the ice climbed up her sides forward, inundating her under the sheer weight of it. Still, they pumped, but at 5 o'clock they knew it was time to give up. She was done, and nobody needed to tell them. Shackleton nodded to Wild, and Wild went forward along the quaking deck to see whether anybody was in the forecastle. He found Howe and Bakewell trying to sleep after a turn at the pumps. He put his head inside. "She's going, boys," he said. "I think it's time to get off."